welcome to our webinar today. We're going to be talking about best practices for commissioning Enphase storage systems. We do this on a monthly basis, so this will be the September update. We've got just the latest things that we want to communicate to you about some of the best practices for commissioning Enphase energy storage systems. My name is Peter Lum. I'm with Enphase's training and education team. Joining us today is got Sumit Saryogi, who's the Senior Director of Digital Engineering, Sunil MS, who's a product manager with digital engineering, Udit Bhargava, who is with our storage engineering team, Bhujan Mandani, product line manager with our energy storage team. So a lot of folks from engineering as well as product management. Also joining me is one of my colleagues, Danny Heidowitz, who's a technical trainer on our training and education team. All right, so what we're going to do today is we're going to be talking about latest commissioning updates, recent best practices, recommendations for installing IQ batteries, as well as IQ8 PV, the latest 8th generation grid forming PV. We're going to have Q&A, and we'll try to finish off with that today. First of all, there is a section called critical updates. So I'm going to go ahead and exit my screen here. I want to give you a little idea of some of the key areas that you might want to go look at when you go to enphase.com. When you go to enphase.com, select installers. And in the installer section, there's a huge amount of information that's available to you. One is the critical updates section. That's over on the left side here. If you go to critical updates, a lot of the things that we'll be talking about today are actually contained in the critical update section. And you can see that it's presented over a bunch of time, right? So we've got June, July, August, and we're going to be probably seeing some September things. So August 31st, for example, that's one of the latest updates here. So this is the critical updates section. If you keep scrolling down, there are some best practices document that you can download, as well as the latest comprehensive commissioning guide. This is a very valuable document, very detailed. You should probably read this beforehand, download that here. So this is an area to go to if you're an installer. Now let me go back to the installer section. The next one I want to show you is the training section, where there's a brand new training page. And the training page shows you things that are related to training. And this is, of course, something that we put together. We've got videos and events and webinars and information about commissioning. So this is the second part I wanted to show you, the installer section of enphase.com, the critical updates for important information about installing systems, and the second is the training page. All right, so let's talk about some best practices. There are some pre-installation best practices. These are things that you should do before you go on site. If you do this, it'll actually speed the way for your installation while you get on site, so things that you should prepare for. The first one is getting trained and certified, something you can find more about that training page. I did want to talk about what you need to be able to install and commission a system. And there's been some confusion by our installers. I just want to make sure that we're all really clear on what you're going to need to be successful in getting out on the field and being able to actually commission a system. In order to commission a system, your company has to be authorized. You have to be an authorized storage installer for Enphase. Now, what does it take to be an authorized installer? Every company, to be authorized, must have at least one certified installer within the company. And in addition to that, the second half of the puzzle is you have to have one storage certified designer. So for a company to be authorized to install and commission a system, you have to have an installer on staff and you have to have a certified designer on staff. These two roles can be fulfilled by one person, or they could be two different people. Now, the question is, how do you become a certified installer? You take online classes. The storage installation certification requires you to come to Enphase University and take the installer certification class for storage. That's the installer certification. For the designer certification, you have to take online designer certification training, and that's on Enphase University. You come and take the 3-hour design certification class and have to submit an actual design to be reviewed by a design review team. You can get all of the principles that you learn during online training, but we want to make sure you understand how to apply all of those principles. So that's what it takes for a company to be authorized. Oftentimes what happens is a company gets on site, there's a certified installer that's there, but the company doesn't have a certified designer. So that's actually going to block that company. It'll block you as the installer sitting on site from installing and commissioning the system. You have to have both of those pieces in place. On top of that, we have qualification courses, so you can learn more about different things like load control, generator. You have to be qualified to install a generator. That means you have to come back, take some additional classes so that you understand how to install a generator. The reason I'm mentioning this, I just want to make sure that we remove confusion about if someone's on site, they can't commission a system. It's because the company has to be authorized. This is all outlined in our training page that I just showed you earlier. The next thing you should do in terms of preparation for your installation is that you have to download the latest installer app, formerly called Installer Toolkit. You might be familiar with that, but the latest installer app from Enphase is 3.26.1. That's the latest version. If you're a Apple user, you load the iOS app from the Apple App Store. If you're an Android user, you go to the Google Play Store, and the same versions apply, 3.26.1. When you download that, the next thing you need to do, and you should do this ahead of time before you go out on site, is ensure that you're logged in with your company ID. So you can see that I put a fake one here, Peter Lum at joesolarcompany.com. You notice it's not Peter Lum at gmail.com. It is not my personal email address. It is actually the company address that's given to me by my company. You want to make sure that you're logged in with your company address, because if you're not, you will not see the systems to be able to commission them. The next thing is that after you've logged in, you want to ensure that you download the latest software to your phone. Your phone or your tablet is the software device that's going to load all of that software into the system once you get connected up. When you go to install a system, it'll check in with the system. If the system is not up to date, it's going to update the system with what's on your phone. So you want to make sure it's got the latest software.
As of this September webinar, the latest gateway software for energy storage systems in your installer app should be 7.0.153 and 7.03.76. The system will automatically select which version to load your system with when you commission. To check if you have the latest versions of software loaded onto your phone, go to the Menu tab in your installer app and then go to the Settings page. The app will display up to date if the software is the current latest versions, but will ask you to download it if it isn't up to date. Now, the best practice here is to set the app for auto download, so it will always download the latest software versions when your phone has an internet connection.
All right, the last best practice for what to do before you go on site is something that we want to continue to encourage, which is creating a system registration or activation early in the cycle of installation. So you can do this on your phone while you're on site, but it's much easier and much faster if you actually create that system ahead of time in the office on a desktop in Enlighten. If you do that early, then when you get on site to install the system, when you bring it up on your phone, everything will populate into your phone. It'll be already there. This is an efficiency best practice. Create the site in Enlighten early before you go on site, and then that will ensure that when you're on site installing, or the person that's installing the system and going to commission the system, they'll automatically find it there. Kind of a best practice hint for efficiency. We just talked about things that you should do before you go on site. Now let's talk about things that you should really think about while you're on site. And these, again, these are some of the key things that we think are high value targets in terms of focus. All right. So the first one is related to CT installation. CTs, of course, are current transformers that are related to the metering system. The metering system in Enphase's backup systems like energy storage or IQ8 PV, the metering system is a critical piece of this because the metering system informs the system of when to charge batteries, when to discharge batteries, determine and program the inverters to behave. So if the CT installations aren't installed correctly, it's likely that your system is going to behave in a different way than you think it's going to behave. Now, there is a significant amount of CT installation errors, up to 50% occurring in the field at times. So I want to cover some best practices for your attention to help you avoid CT installation errors. The first best practice recommendation is to review some of the key basic CT installation principles. You can do this through the CT Essentials course in Enphase University. This online short course covers 95% of the errors made in installing and wiring production and consumption CTs. There are 3 lessons in the course, which take about 15 minutes in total to go through, and well worth it, I think, if it will help you avoid an error. Well, you'll have to go back and fix a problem on site later. The next common CT installation error is related to the placement of consumption CTs in the system. Installers place the CT on the load side of the system controller, wanting to measure consumption of the backup loads in the system. This is actually the wrong place to install the consumption CTs, as the system needs to meter all loads and consumption to properly control the system. Consumption CTs therefore must be installed on the line or grid side of the system controller for proper operation and system metering. So you need to ensure that the consumption CTs are loaded on the line side of the system controller. A third common error found in metering of systems is related to misphasing of the voltage and current measurements of the system. This means the current and voltage measurements are coming from different phases. We can see it more clearly in this picture. The drawing shows that line 1 from the grid is feeding the IQ gateway line 1 power. This connection is also how the gateway gets its line 1 voltage measurement for metering. We also see the line 1 CT on the same line 1 voltage wire. The CT is connected into the line 1 CT port of the IQ gateway, which is how we get the current measurement for line 1. So the power measurement is going to be correct for line 1 as we are measuring voltage and current from line 1 together. Line 2 is also aligned in its phase, with the line 2 grid power going into the line 2 terminal of the IQ gateway and the line 2 CT on the same line 2 grid line, with the CT connected into the CT2 connection at the IQ gateway. The problem we run into is when installers don't check to ensure that the wire the line 1 CT is on is actually line 1 wire from the grid, and also the same line 1 at the IQ gateway, just in case wiring is crossed somewhere in the house or electrical panel. So you have to check that it goes all the way through. Checking phases is critical best practice to ensuring metering is properly installed. Testing for phasing is covered in the CT Essentials online course, so check it out more there. Okay. The next best practice is related to having a third-party PV within an Enphase energy storage environment. We do support systems where you have third-party PV that's outside of the microgrid. So I've got 2 pictures here. One is a whole home backup system. The second one is a partial backup system. And we've called out that there is a third-party PV that's not in the microgrid, right? And this is how you have to do it. If you have third-party PV like SMA or Fronius or SolarEdge or something like that, you've got a third-party PV system, and you want to integrate this into a IQ battery system, then this PV has to reside outside of the microgrid. How do we measure the PV production from the third-party PV systems? Because we want to measure how much that PV produces, because it does affect how the system works. You add a second set of CTs. So On the output wire of line 1, you would put a CT, and you would just essentially go purchase a second consumption CT, and you would put that on the input output side of your PV going into your main load center, and you would take that CT and then you would wire it in parallel with your consumption CT from the meter, and then into your Envoy gateway or your iCube gateway. All right, next best practice. This has to do with your communications kit. As most of you know, the communications kit is a wireless communications kit that gets plugged into the Envoy, and this communications kit is the device that communicates with the iCube batteries as well as the iCube system controller. We do this wirelessly, and so this is the wireless comms kit. What we have is we have a little situation with the comms kit getting plugged in, and when we're updating the software, it could potentially render the comms kit non-functional, and that has to do with a software load. So the thing that we want you to do is when you are bringing the system up, you need to update the Envoy software from your phone. Remember, the phone is getting the latest software and then it's going to update the system. When you are updating the Envoy software, you want to make sure that this communications kit is actually unplugged. So that means that you bring the system up, you connect your phone using AP mode, you download, update the software in the Envoy, and you do that with the comms kit unplugged. After you've updated the Envoy software, then you go ahead and plug your comms kit in and continue the system commissioning. If you go to do the commissioning, if you're trying to provision your batteries and you're trying to provision the system controller and you get an infinite waiting for acknowledgement message where it never provisions, then it's possible that your comms kit has been rendered inoperable. Essentially, the comms kit gets bricked, and so if that happens, then you should replace the comms kit. Our recommendation is actually you should carry a second comms kit just in case that happens. Now, how do you avoid this? Make sure that the comms kit is unplugged before you update the Envoy software, and then you'll be good. Okay. Next best practice is about the manual override. I think most of you know this already, but I want to remind you that the system controller comes with a manual override in the override position. That's the left position. So this manual override is shipped in the override position, and there's reasons why we do that. I won't cover that right now. But when you go to commission the system, the bottom line is you have to remove the system override from the override position, which is on the left side, and flip the switch to the right. And that's the picture of the hand here pulling the override switch down. And you want to do this before you commission the system, before you energize the system, actually. So when your system is installed and all of the components are installed, so all the battery components, the microinverters, before you energize the system, you remove this out of override position. And that's the only time you want to do this. If you don't have your batteries installed yet and you just have the system controller, don't take it out of the override. It's when you're ready to commission the system, everything is installed, go ahead and remove it out of the override by flipping the switch from the left to right.
If you do energize the system and have forgotten to disable the override switch, do not flip the override switch with the system energized. Doing this will signal an error in the system that can't be cleared unless you call the support line. Now, to flip the override switch after the system has gotten power to it, you have to de-energize the system. Now, remember to tell the homeowner you're going to do this. Turn off all power, allow the system to rest for 1 minute to discharge capacitors in the system controller. Now, after the 1 minute wait, then you can disable the override and then re-energize the system.
All right, so those are probably the highlights in terms of installing our energy storage system in terms of commissioning. So if you pay attention to those, I think it'll really benefit you a lot. All right, we're going to spend a little time and talk about installing and commissioning IQ8 systems. All right, so these are, of course, the 8th generation grid forming microinverters. IQ8 can be installed in several different configurations. The first one is a solar only configuration. All right, and that's a grid tied solar configuration, just like installing IQ7s. The IQ8s will be installed just like IQ7s, and they're just used strictly as grid tied. In that configuration, there's no backup power. It's just solar for grid tied. The second configuration is called sunlight backup. Sunlight backup is now taking those inverters and saying, this is not just a grid tied system. These inverters can actually form a grid if the utility goes away. So that means that customers that have sunlight backup, if the utility fails, if they've got sun on solar panels, you're going to get power in the house. That's called sunlight backup. That's using IQ8s to form a grid and create backup power. To do this, there's a requirement. You're going to have to add a system controller, the system controller 2 specifically, and you're going to have to add an IQ load controller to manage loads. Beyond that, you can start adding batteries. Now, sunlight backup is solar only, so there's assuming no batteries to do backup. The next 2, home essentials and full energy independence, is adding batteries on top of your solar. So the nice thing about this is this gives homeowners choices. If they want to start off with just grid-tied solar, and later they've got a little more budget, they want to add some backup system using solar, then they can add that. And if they want to add power capability when the sun goes down, because sunlight backup only works when there's sun, then they can add batteries. Nice additions there. Okay, so those are the configurations. If you are installing IQ8, then there are some training requirements. If you're installing grid-tied IQ8, no backup system, you don't have any certification requirements. You can continue to install IQ8s like IQ7s, and there's no additional training that Enphase requires. However, if you're starting to install IQ8 where it's in a backup configuration, that's sunlight backup, or one of the ones with batteries, then you're going to have to get certified with IQ8. Even if you're storage certified today, if you're going to install IQ8, you still have to go back and get the IQ8 certification also. And then you'll need to be PV certified. Now, this is for some of our new installers that have never installed Enphase PV before. We require you to get PV certified if you're going to do IQ8. If you're an experienced installer, you get a little test. Hey, just show us that you've got the latest information on Enphase PV. We'll pass you right out of that course, and then you can go straight to IQ8. All right, a couple things about installing IQ8. The first is that you're going to need to put a system controller 2 in. We have an IQ system controller version 1, IQ system controller version 2. You just want to make sure that you've got IQ system controller 2 in for IQ8 configurations, right? The second thing is when you install IQ8 and you install a system controller, you have to put a new device in to the mix. And that is called the Enphase Energy System Shutdown Switch. And you can't forget this, right? So if you're installing IQ8, you have to put this switch in. What does this switch do? This switch provides all of the rapid shutdown requirements needed to be compliant to rapid shutdown. And so that rapid shutdown switch is a separate switch. It can get located anywhere. So if your system controller is inside, you can wire the system controller, the shutdown switch outside so that firefighters can have a rapid shutdown initiator. That's this switch right there. Now, the way that this switch gets wired, this is the best practice again, is that you have to be really careful about how you wire this, because this switch gets wired into the RSD, or rapid shutdown device, port of the system controller 2. You have to wire this exactly, and you have to wire this correctly. One thing I will say about this, critically important, please take note of this, is that you should never wire this switch when the system is hot, all right? Now, we've had circumstances where installers, they power everything up, they power the house up, and they say, oh, I forgot to put the system shutdown switch in, and you don't want to turn the power off to the house, all right? So you should not wire this hot. So the second way to do this is make sure that you disconnect the header, because there's actually a plug-in header that goes into this port. Remove the header, wire the switch with the header removed, and then plug the header in. If you short something, you'll actually you could take out a component in the system controller.
The next critical best practice for installing IQ8 microinverters in a backup system configured with a system controller is the power for the IQ gateway or Envoy has to be moved from being powered on the IQ combiner bus to run directly from the system controller bus. Not doing this could cause the system to not function correctly, and more importantly, could cause a failure of a system component in the system controller. The picture shown here is how the IQ gateway is typically powered from the breaker on the combiner bus directly to the IQ gateway. This is a wrong wiring configuration when using IQ8 microinverters. For correct wiring, the IQ gateway can't be powered from the IQ combiner. It has to be powered directly from the common bus in the IQ system controller. There are a few ways to do this. Pictured here is one approved method to do this. To power the Envoy off of the system controller bus, you can relocate the IQ gateway breaker from the combiner, if it's an Eaton breaker, to the system controller generator breaker slot. Just move the circuit breaker from the combiner to the system controller, put it in the generator slot, and run wires directly from the breaker back to the IQ gateway in the combiner to power the IQ gateway. Now, you'll only be able to do this if there isn't any plan to install a generator. Also, if the IQ combiner has anything other than an Eaton breaker, you won't be able to move it to the system controller. So you'll have to find another Eaton breaker replacement for the system controller. If the generator slot is being reserved or used, a second method to power the IQ gateway directly from the system controller bus is to remove and replace the 40 amp neutral forming transformer or NFT breaker and replace that with a 4020 quad breaker. It's got to be Eaton 4020 quad. Using a quad breaker, wires connected to the 20 amp section of the quad breaker can be used to feed the IQ gateway, and then the 40 amp section of the quad breaker will be connected to the NFT breaker. There is a third method to power the IQ gateway from the system controller common bus, which isn't shown here. And that's to wire the Envoy directly to the backup loads panel. Since the backup loads panel is connected to the system controller bus, this method is an approved one. Installers, any of these three methods will work to move the power from the combiner bus to the system controller bus. The important thing is you have to move it with IQ8 microinverters, and that's the best practice.
Let's see, last thing here, and then we're going to try to get to some questions, is ensuring that you have the very latest software to support IQ8 installations, all right? So remember I said that in the very beginning, you want to make sure that your installer app has the very latest software. And when you have the very latest software, that latest software is going to support IQ8, and so you want to make sure you get the very latest software. So the latest installer app is going to be 3.26.1. That's the one you're going to want to use. And then the latest Envoy software is going to be 7.00.153 is the latest one here. Okay. All right. One last note here is the system controller has got the latest firmware, and Enphase is now loading the very latest firmware into the system controller. And so what that means for you is that when you connect up your installer app to commission the system, your installer app is probably going to indicate that there needs to be a little bit of a software update to make sure that you have the latest software before you go ahead and commission the system. Okay, so when you get this message, you actually want to wait. You want to wait until the system is ready for functional validation, ready to finish your commissioning. So make sure you wait for that when that happens.